Hello and welcome to another Bevington Group webinar. Now, today I'm going to be talking about organizational design, but before I really get stuck in, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land from which I am broadcasting. They are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation because I am here in Sydney today. Well, welcome everyone. So there's plenty of content in this, as there always is in a Bevington Group webinar. As always, feel free to send us a question and we will try our best to answer. There is a possibility of doing Q&A during the webinar, but often it's the case that we don't have time because we do like to finish on time, and it's usually a very content-rich experience, the webinars. So today we'll just talk a little bit about what we mean by org design and its importance, and then we're going to go through some questions you can ask to test your org design. Now, these questions are drawn from two papers. I'll explain what the papers are and their heritage a little bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the models that we use when we're doing org design that are useful. And if you're really interested in some reading for you, I'm not sure the reading makes you necessarily an org designer, but it's a bit like if you read the manual of your car mechanic, like it doesn't make you a mechanic. You do need some practice at these skills, but nonetheless, it allows you to have a better conversation with your mechanic. And that's an analogy or a metaphor from one of my staff today. Okay, so importance of org design, let's get stuck straight in. So Kessler and Cates, and Cates in particular, is one of the leading lights modern org design space, but they describe org design as basically aligning the organization's strategy, structure, people, and processes. Now, actually, today, a lot of people leave processes off the list. So it's often strategy aligning with structure and people. But in reality, as we'll come to a little bit later, the strategy itself needs to be consistent with the environment, and the structure needs to be consistent with the environment as well as strategy. But we'll come to that in a few minutes' time, and we'll give you a number of different ways of looking at that. Now, for those who used to work with Bevington, org design, therefore, is part of a broader discipline, or the operating model design discipline. It's the subset of operating model design, if you like, whereas operating model design will cover things like infrastructure and ways of working and disciplines and governance and things like your compliance structures. So that's that. And obviously it's important because this is how work gets done. So within context, just to put it in context, you would start with your mission and vision, of course, build out strategy. Business model is how value is captured. If you're a business, how do you make money? If you're a government entity, how do you deliver community value? Then the operating model and org design fits within that operating model layer. So that's what we're talking about today. So this is an interesting time to do this because you're going to have some holidays soon. The time I'm talking now, of course, is the Christmas holidays. And it's often a time when people think about, are they structured right? And a great couple of ways to approach this is some research that's been around for quite some time in a paper produced by Gould and Campbell in the Harvard Business Review 2002. It's often referred to by org designers because it gives a couple of tests. Now, it doesn't actually help you do the design, but what it can do is help you test your own org design and help you test some designs that you can come up with to develop alternatives. So we're going to go through them pretty quickly, and then we'll get into some others, and then we'll actually take you through some of the models that we use to build up the org design. So if we say these are tests, there is some information on how you actually create hypotheses to test. So let's get started. So the market advantage test. So this is the old piece, which is structure should follow strategy, or their version of it. And it's just a little bit more specific. So the market's advantage test really says there are two things you have to really look at in your org design. The first is, what are your markets? Now, this is a good discipline. It says, well, what markets are you in? For example, you might be in selling receivables financing in Western Australia or receivables financing in Queensland. So you've got could have a combination, for example, of product and geographic markets where you think the geographies are different and you need a different approach. And then you might actually then have something like a competitive advantage that goes across all of those markets, and that would be a sensible thing to do. And in this case, it might be speed, it might be flexibility, or it might be price. So it's important to actually get a handle on both of those things. So your structure, your processes, your org design really should actually match the market that you're in and contribute to your market advantage. So this is a little bit more meat on the bone for the old structure follow strategy test. And it's actually a bit better because often you can make any structure fit any strategy if you're creative enough in your description. So, and in the example here, we've got a global retail chain, but it could be a national retail chain where a lot of freedom is given to what's called the customer segment group. And the customer segment group can tailor experiences to drive loyalty. So store types are split into different customer markets in this particular case, because the thought is you'll deliver value very differently across those different customer groups. So market advantage test, that makes sense. And we do see lots of examples where this test is essentially breached. For example, where you actually need an awful lot of innovation and flexibility in a fast-moving market, but you've got what I would describe as an ossified org structure. For example, it's functional and slow. And you sort of start to go backwards because you can't keep up in innovation. Now, parenting advantage test. So this is, in our view, a better way to think about spans and layers. So one way to think about a layer above the layer you're considering, the parent layer, is what function does it perform in the organization? So the idea is, first of all, you list all the functions. What does a parenting layer do? What advantage does it offer the organization? And then you go, well, jeepers, if it's the same advantage as the layer below, then you've got a layer that's redundant. So basically, this is a way of testing the value that a layer adds rather than just spans and layers. You know, I've got one person and 7 people reporting. The problem with spans and layers is, of course, that you actually have an awful lot of factors other than the sheer number of people that are reporting to you. It could be that the people are all new, so it's a heavier load. It could be that it's highly technical. It could be that that particular manager, for example, in a particular layer, has a lot of expert work to do themselves and doesn't actually have as much time to lead. So there's an awful lot of factors to consider. And you have to consider all of those factors when doing a restructure. But another factor to consider is quite simply, does it add the same value as the layer below? So it's very, very handy. That's the parenting advantage test. Then there's the people test. Now, structure should follow strategy. And of course, everyone will tell you that, of course, you should hire your people to match the structure which follows strategy. Okay. The practical problem, particularly in a large organization, is your starting point is the people you've got. So can you fit the people you've got into the roles that you want to redesign? So can you actually make it work with the people you've got? Or are you finding yourself in a situation where you'd have to rehire half the organization? Now, I'm exaggerating a bit, but the people test is important. It's also important even just in doing the change management. So do you have the right characters in place? And there's some interesting research on the nature of the people you hire, the right personalities in place with some of the capabilities, and you need to do training to fill out the rest, that sort of thinking. Now, the feasibility test very much fits with the people test. So a feasibility would be, well, actually, have I created a job that's doable? Can I hire for that job? Is it too broad? So this is a key practical point, but it might also be something like your organizational structure that you truly desire won't work because a regulator won't like it. We have a lot of regulated businesses, and that might be a challenge. So these are very practical fit tests. Now, the idea of fit, does your structure, in this case, mostly fit with strategy, but there are other things we'll explain later and has to fit with, is the first and most famous fit test. But this gives you actually a better and deeper way to think about it. Now, as I said, this doesn't do the design. It doesn't help you create design options, but it helps you just test. And it starts to get you thinking. With all of these questions, they're great to ask in a group of leaders. So you can ask and answer them yourselves, but a group discussion also produces a much richer conversation to be had elsewhere. But it basically just makes sure that you're actually covering the ideas The problem with aligning anything to strategy is if you're creative enough, you can try sort of twist any structure to sound like it fits the strategy. So you're better off with a group. Okay. Now, effectively, Gould and Campbell didn't finish there. They actually did some good design tests. So one's the fit test, and that idea of fit is very important, be it fit with strategy or be it fit with the environment, which we'll come to later. Then there's the cultural test, which is the specialist cultural test being the most important one, which is you might have an organization, for example, that is in a very stable environment, that has a strategy that's a cost strategy, but you've decided that you actually want to try competing somewhere different and in a different way. So in a different market, in a different way. So let's say you have a differentiation rather than cost advantage. That might mean it's a specialist business unit, and it might mean you need to put it somewhere else to either give it focus, and we'll come to focus in a few minutes' time, or to make sure it's protected from the dominant culture. So if this piece of the organization needs to move faster, needs to spend more money, needs to actually be dramatically more empowered, it possibly shouldn't report to a part of organization which is deliberately more controlled, deliberately tighter, and deliberately basically pushes decisions up the chain for deep consideration before anything moves. So that's thing one. The next thing is the difficult links test. Now, mostly Gould and Campbell say you should leave different organizational leaders alone to try to basically make the links work themselves. But we all know that always doesn't work, or often doesn't work. And that's because different parts of the organization will have different KPIs or objectives quite often, and people will go to their objectives. So a difficult link test is about finding the parts of the organization where you think the relationship is going to be most fraught and figure out what you're going to do about it. So it might be a process answer, like an arbitration process. It might be that you actually bring them together and actually have a single leader. It might be a KPI type solution where they both have to collaborate, both entities have to collaborate to be able to deliver a KPI, or a combination of the above. It's often a combination. But basically, this is focus your attention on a particular part of the organization that is a difficult link. Redundant hierarchy. This is unnecessary layers and duplication. We've talked about some of the ways. So one way is to think about, does the layer above form the same functions as the layer below? Then you actually might think about, well, what's the leadership load that that organization has? How much actually work does a particular person have at a layer? So you can actually, that's actually much more tactical. You're seeing, is the job possible? Can that person have more scope given their workload? And there are lots of others. We don't have time to go through them today, but it's a conscious test of the hierarchy. Flatter organizations, there's other research, actually do have advantages, and the advantages of a flatter organization include things like conscientiousness. It actually does change the personality characteristic as measured of the organization. And things like conscientiousness or openness to change or willingness to collaborate actually do improve in flatter organizations. So there's plenty of research on that, so it's worthwhile considering. Now, the accountability test, we all know this. Are we clear who's accountable for what? Can get very confusing if it's not clear. And then the flexibility test. So this is scenario modeling. This says, okay, so I've convinced myself that this particular structure, say, fits with strategy. Okay, what if the context changes? So you will say the context changes. Can I actually use this org structure to deliver when the environment's different or we've tweaked our strategy? So you run some scenarios and see if it still works. So as I said, these tests don't get you to org design. And the way we actually do it is we produced hypotheses on org design and then they get tested. But they're really good questions to ask to see either whether your current organization is working the way it should, i.e., is it set up for fit and good design? And think about those two things because they're a pretty cool way to think about it. And do you need to do something, or to really sift between the options that you have available if you're doing a redesign exercise? So very handy and very good to think about if you're having some holiday deep thinking. Okay, that's not the only set of questions that org designers often use. If the set of questions that we have above, almost it's a deep thinking exercise, or a deeper thinking exercise, I should say. But if you want a quicker test, this is from Beeson, and this is again Harvard Business Review, and this is handy. They're more basic, actually, so it's faster, but nonetheless handy if you've a little bit time poor. So the first thing is, though, be clear about your value proposition and source of competitive advantage. Now, actually, often organizations aren't entirely clear. So it might be that some people in the organization are clear, but often if you ask managers, and this is a test we often perform, what do they think the competitive advantage of the organization is, even in the same business unit, you might get different answers. So it's hard to get buy into an org structure if you're not all on the same page with regard to strategy. This example is the Amazon value proposition, which makes sense. Selection and variety, price and deals, convenience and speed, kind of where they're going with this. They're an interesting question as to whether all of this works as well as it should, subject for another day, but you can see where they're coming from. So they design themselves accordingly. And you could definitely argue that they've done a good job at that. Then you go, okay, so I know, going back to here, excuse me, I know what my value proposition is and my source of competitive advantage. Then what capabilities do I need to deliver that? Now, first of all, what's a capability? Well, basically, it's the ability to do something, which is usually people, systems, processes wrapped together. So it's a number of different parts of your operating model that actually work together to deliver a capability. So a capability to build cars, repair cars, provide medical services, price insurance in the industrial space, whatever it happens to your capability happens to be. But you've also got distinctive capabilities that are very deeply strategic. In other words, they're the capabilities that align with your strategy. So here are Aldi's capabilities, and they should make sense. So an external person would say, yes, Aldi are good at that. In this case, Aldi's competitive capabilities are competitive pricing and operational efficiency, which supports the competitive pricing. So what they're very good is at figuring out how to deliver a product in a store at a better price. And they have all the cost structure thinking and processes to be able to match that. They're competitive capabilities, so their structures need to be set up accordingly. So the structures will be lean. The structures will have an awful lot of clean process. The structures will, in many places, have a dent towards training their own staff, et cetera, in their methods and processes. So, second question, what are your capabilities? Then when you've got your capabilities, the question goes, now, how do you organize your capabilities? So basically, what this one's saying, you do have to be clear on your strategy, but also your capabilities. And this is what we usually do as well. We're interested in what are the strategic capabilities? What do you absolutely have to get right to win? And then you can think about your structure. So very simply, functional silos actually tend to work best in stable environments, and they tend to work well where you want to do something like bring different capabilities together, for example, so you can drive them to a lower cost position. So it's not necessarily flexible and it's not necessarily adaptive, not necessarily fast moving. You might want to go something like a matrix for that. So whatever your strategy is, are you set up to deliver strategy and are you set up to deliver on those capabilities? Okay, then leadership. Now, so this is where you go to the previous question. Are your people right for the strategy? Are the people right for the capabilities? Are your people therefore right for the structure that you want to put in place? So again, this could be a capabilities, but a competence question. This could be people capabilities. So because capabilities often used two ways, strategic capabilities, which is basically skills, yes, but it's also processes. It's also effectively the systems that you've got to run those processes. So, but this is very much about if you've got the right skills and if you've got the right personality types. Now, there is quite a lot of research on the importance of different types of personality type. So, for example, if you're in a fast-moving, innovative context and that's consistent with your strategy, you'll tend to have a different type of person. They'll be on the personality characteristics, more open to change. They might be more collaborative, and they might have a different risk tolerance, effectively. Okay, so what type of leadership? And then what practices are required to actually make it all work. So the idea here is pretty straightforward. You've developed a structure that's consistent with the capabilities you need and consistent with your strategy. Okay, what are the other bits you need? And this is where an operating model is very handy. And this is the Bevington first layer of the Bevington operating model wheel. So it might be you need different ways of working. You need different ceremonies, as the agile practitioners describe them. You need different ways of thinking about how your processes work. You might need different metrics. You almost certainly will need different metrics, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the other pieces of the puzzle? So these are some ways to test whether there's something to see, whether it's worthwhile doing something about your org design. Now, probably you're not going to ask the questions if you weren't noticing some pain or feeling some pain. So if you do ask, you're likely to get somewhere, because otherwise, why would you ask? Here we go, operating model methodology. So essentially, an organization doesn't just run an org design. It's got many parts of the element, but it's not sufficient. So the org design, for example, doesn't consider systems. And of course, in a modern workplace, work gets delivered by people and computer systems. So it doesn't consider your automation journey. It doesn't necessarily consider how you're going to make AI work in your existing organization, for example, to be very contemporary. So you've got to think about other bits of the puzzle. And this is where the operating model context come in. There are other webinars around in the operating model, should you wish to think about them. But you do need to think about them. And ways of working is a biggie, and of course, systems is a huge one. And those who know us will know that we think of the orchestra as a good metaphor for an operating model. Everyone knows where to sit. They know where to put the sheet music. They know where to look for the conductor. And all of that leads to actually a flexible and consistent both approach. Okay. So those are the questions you can ask to basically see whether either an operating model that you've got at the moment, or basically an org design that you've got at the moment, or whether some of your hypotheses are likely to work. They're great ways to test. But are they sufficient of themselves? Well, they won't help you generate an hypothesis. So let's have a look at some ways that help you develop an hypothesis. And these are only helpful, they are not complete. But they basically give you a good start. And it's a bit like if you're working with a professional org designer like a Bevington person, they're actually great to have read because they enable a better conversation. Now, Kessler and Cates is one, Cates being particularly well known, and then Burton et al. Is another. Now, these are both robust frameworks. Kessler and Cates a bit loose, and Burton et al. A bit tighter. The Burton et al. Framework addresses that particular nuggety problem we talked about in the first set of questions, which is fit. And the idea is that each of the layers on the right-hand side actually fit. And this is where we get this idea of environment and strategy, i.e. not just strategy. In fact, your strategy should fit your environment. So you have a different strategy for a very stable environment, for example. You have a different strategy for a turbulent environment, to just name a couple. And then the org design needs to fit not just with the strategy, but with the environment. So we'll get into some of these in a little bit more detail, but we're going to now just have a look at Kessler and Cates. So this is design drivers. So think of these as lenses or ways to produce hypotheses or ideas. And it can be used both ways. So it can be used to test a model, and it can be used to help you generate ideas. So the idea behind a design driver is different designs actually are relevant for a different objective that you want to achieve. So what's driving your design? It might be a particular objective. So for example, you might look through the management attention lens. So the classic example here is you want to set up a business in an entirely new market. It's too small normally to report through to the CEO, but because it's so important for you strategic, in spite of its very small size, it's going to be a direct report to the CEO to actually, one, give it the organizational authority, and authority does matter, and to basically give a direct line to the CEO so the CEO potentially can do the coaching necessary to get the job done. But management attention. So management attention being something that's actually quite often forgotten. What that, of course, means is you have to be prepared to flex your model. So once that business is established, it might drop out of the CEO's direct line. Leverage resources. This is for when your strategy is really about cost. Now, of course, you can do this when it's not about cost, but this is about bringing parts of the organization together effectively to be able to generate efficiencies. You could actually be bringing them together to standardize, bringing them together to make sure that the gaps in workload are all covered. You could be bringing them together so it's a sensible place from which to do the change, which is automation, all sorts of reasons that you can bring them together. You might also going to go to the top right-hand corner, bring parts of the organization together for specialization reasons. So, and you don't want, for example, your tax specialists all distributed might be an example. You might want to bring them together where they can be mutually supportive. They can discuss serious problems together. They can have a cohesive career development plan. They can have the right partners, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then there's coordination and integration. So let's say, for example, you have a functional structure because it's still actually the most common structure. But you do have to get product development done. So what's your means? What are your processes? What are your practices? What are your decision rights that are associated with getting that job done? And a good way to do it is, for example, to have ownership of processes. So you're creating integration points so that you can have cross-functional collaboration, basically. So you have to design that. So this is where operating model thinking is broader and possibly better than just org design alone, because it thinks in a systems way, systems thinking way, about the different integration points. Control and accountability. You ask yourself the question, actually, what are the biggest decisions that have to be made day to day, medium term, long term? And where does accountability sit for those decisions? And if that accountability is split, is that acceptable for us? And if it is split, how are we going to actually cope with that? So that might lead to different governance systems, or it might mean you throwing that org design out because you just actually can't get the accountability working. And this, of course, as you all know, is an immensely common problem. And then learning and motivation. Now, it's great that Kessler and Kate put that in because high performance organizations are generally learning organizations. So they actually learn, they get better, either efficiency, innovation, getting close to customer, whatever it happens to be. They're learning organizations, they develop their people. And that links very tightly to motivation, as people like to be an organization that develops them. How are you going to do that? Do you have a coaching approach? Do you consciously develop people's experience by putting them on different jobs? All sorts of different ways to do that. Okay, so that's the Kessler and Kate's design drivers approach. Very, very handy. So now we're going to just flip to this, which is the fit idea. Now, we started with fit because we were looking at Gould and Campbell's questions. The first set was fit. Now, this idea of fit is not just extant in the literature, but it is really, really handy in practice. Now, we don't often put this in front of our clients, but this is something we would do in the background. We would say, okay, what do we think the environment's like? Is the environment, for example, turbulent? Is it stable? Is it what we call locally stormy, which is it's mostly pretty stable environment, but it's stormy in some parts, okay? You'd have different strategies to basically run a business that's in a very turbulent environment than run a business that's in a very stable environment. Then you go, well, does the environment fit with strategy? We might do a first test. We would express our concerns. If there was a misfit, and have a conversation with the client as why. And then once we're clear on those two, then you go into the organizational prototype. Now, the prototype's where you often start. It's not an org structure. This is kind of a sketch, if you like, might be a good way to put it, of what the different groupings of capability are in an organization. And there are also actually different types of organization structure that are talked about in the literature. So, for example, in one type of organization, there's a structure called a prospector type of strategy and structure. And effectively, that's the strategy, and that leads to a matrix type organization. And a prospector type of strategy is one that's highly innovative and flexible structures tend to lead to matrix or agile type of structures. So you're basically lining things up, saying, okay, what sort of strategy, what sort of environment leads us to develop that strategy, and then structure from there. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these. That would be an entirely new presentation, but fit test. And this is a very robust approach, but you wouldn't put it in front of anyone. It's kind of something that you do in the background to test because it does get a bit technical, particularly as you go through the different layers. Okay, but what could you have a broad conversation internally about when you're actually thinking about it? Well, you can certainly ask those questions and use them to test. And the other thing that you can do is use a little bit more of Kessler and Cates. So Kessler and Cates basically do another useful thing, which is they point out ways things can fail. So you ask the questions, and there are basically three sets of questions we proposed. You can test for fit using Burton et al. The other thing you can do is say, well, how will things fail? And that this is a good source of literature. There's a lot of literature. This is just a particularly good summary. So structure isn't linked to strategy. Okay, that's a reason for it to fail. It could be actually that strategy isn't clear or strategy is not distributed. People don't know their strategy. People don't know their sources of competitive advantage, and so don't make the right decisions. So failure to define must-win capabilities. Well, you can't be really outstanding at everything. So what do you need to be outstanding at, and where do you need to be just good enough? Collaboration across silos. I think we all know about that one. Integration mechanisms not working, where you actually need to collaborate there. You cannot set up a structure that meets every need. Everything is a trade-off. And to deal with some of those trade-offs, you need other ways of working, ceremonies, committees, councils, clever ways to set up KPIs and all sorts of other things. Talent and leadership not considered. So you've got a great structure, but you've got the wrong leaders, or you haven't thought about the fit between leadership and the structure and the strategy. And of course, you know what happens there. And of course, transition poorly managed, which is often the case. So some other things to think about: environment and strategy misalignment, very, very common. So well, I found it enormously common in spite of the fact that the most commonly quoted mantra is that structure should follow strategy, but yeah, it's misaligned. And we think one of the reasons is folks often don't consider the environment, and also what and how people are competing is not broadly communicated, particularly in large organizations. So that piece isn't necessarily nailed. Structure and process fit. So we know that structure is not the only way that organizations work. So you do need to actually think deeply about your process. Now, you can't actually go down to keystroke level when you're doing an org design, but what you can do is roughly know what way a customer journey flows through your organization, what way a critical process flows through your organization, what sort of decisions arise, who's accountable for those decisions, and who's looking after the quality of the execution of that process. All of that you can know. Leadership and org climate misfit, I think I've talked about that. Now, one of the challenges is just size and complexity. So this is related to leadership in that you can just have too much in your portfolio. And you can have too much in your portfolio if the layers below you are just not quite skilled enough or are learning in position. So you can have a size issue, and you can also have a complexity issue in that not all functions are equally complex. And often in a turbulent environment, you will remain basically in a complex kind of status for longer. Overloaded technology and information processing gaps, basically tech debt or not moving fast enough. If you've seen our presentations on AI, you'll note that our hypothesis is, and there's plenty of evidence that we've got to be able to back it up, that Australia is catching up in AI, but we're certainly not in the lead. And there's a little bit of resistance on it, but it's not just AI. There are actually a lot of technologies that have been available for a while, for example, to automate and improve productivity, and productivity is a national problem that we haven't picked up and used. So effectively, you can have tech debt, and you can also have failure to pick up the new technologies as well. And they're often very useful for enabling some of these structures. And then incentives misaligned with goals. So often what we find is that the metrics piece is sort of done last, that it's quickly done at the end of thinking about an org structure and not properly reflected on. So quite some time ago, we started actually thinking about the metrics really early in a restructuring project. And the main reason for that is to make sure that we knew where the accountabilities were for a different metric. And the way we do that is to think about the value driver tree. And again, it's available in others presentations that we do. In a value driver tree effectively takes an outcome on the left-hand side. If you're a for-profit organization, that might be profit, EBITDA, whatever it happens to be. You break that down into, say, revenue and cost. You break down revenue and cost into its component parts. So revenue might be number of customers, number of products, average price per product, churn of customers, whatever it happens to be. And you go right, you break up each contributor and you go right until you find you want to stop looking. right? But you don't need to do any further analysis. What you're really doing is saying, well, in your executive structure, for every part of that value driver tree, you need to have a clear understanding of who is accountable for that particular part, who's accountable for those numbers. So very important, and you can use these as well. Okay, so we're coming to an end, so I'll just do a brief summary. So effectively, org structures can be complicated. They can be very difficult to execute. And one of the reasons they're difficult to execute is because you're changing power structures. So there'll be winners and losers. You want to, before you start, actually think about, do you need to do this? So the questions for tests are great questions to ask, and we've given you 3 sets of questions to see whether there's something to do here. And it might be you just need to tidy up, it might be perhaps something in a function that needs to be restructured, it might be something in a division, or it might be clarity of accountabilities that can just be a little bit better, or it might be something deeper. So the questions really allow you to think about whether you go deeper, because they're often big exercises, and they're often very emotional exercises. You're changing power structures and certainly potentially changing people's jobs. So doing it properly matters. Once you've got the questions, there are ways to think about generating hypotheses to test. So we've got 3 sets of questions for you, and we've given you 2 types of model here. Now, there are others, and Beaverton itself has its own amalgam model, but these sorts of models are useful for generating hypotheses. Now, it's like the mechanic manual piece. Just because you've read the book doesn't mean you can do it, but actually having read the book does give you the ability to ask smarter questions and have conversations amongst yourselves. And it is a collaborative exercise. You will need to get multiple views. And one of those approaches focuses on fit. That's Burton et al., the different layers fit. And we've particularly like to stress 2 things about that. One, not just that strategy fits with the structure, but actually that your environment fits with strategy and then structure. That's the first thing. And of course, leadership matters. And then Burton et al. Give you a really good way to think about the problems that you could be facing in your org design, but they've also got design drivers. So lenses from which you can generate hypotheses, but also lenses through which you can test the model. All right. So that should give you some tools to think about. Do you need to do an org design? Is there something to see here? Do you just have a tweak to do? And to be able to have some conversations internally with your colleagues. As always, if you've any questions, feel free to give us a call. But we're finishing off just a few minutes early, which is always a good thing. Thank you very much for joining us here today.